adopted by the committee November 28th, 2022. The meeting is today dealing with the development and support of the electronics, metals, and plastics recycling industry. This is a hybrid meeting. I have the honor to introduce the witnesses that will be with us today. We have the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Teresa McLennan, Executive Director and Counsel, the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, Dawn Madabi-Leach, President.
Christina Seidel, Directrice Executive.
Christina Seidel, Executive Director. And from Tech Resources Limited, we have Thompson Hickey, General Manager, and Amber Johnston Billings, Vice President, Government Affairs, Health, Safety, Environment, and Community Systems. We will begin in just a moment, though.
Alors, nous allons commencer.
We will begin forthwith with Madame McClenaghan from the Canadian Environmental Law Association. 5 minutes.
I just want to advise witnesses and members that we're expecting a vote at 6:10, so bells will start ringing at 5:40. So unfortunately, we'll have to adjourn the meeting probably a little earlier, but we'll get to that in due time. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses today for being with us. And without further ado, Madame McClenaghan, the floor is yours. And I'm sorry if I mispronounce your last name. Apologies for that. So.
McClenaghan, merci. Je m'appelle.
Thank you. My name is Teresa McClenaghan, and I use English because it is better for me and probably for you.
Thank you very much for inviting the Canadian Environmental Law Association to speak to you as a witness today on this important study on reusing materials and supporting a circular economy. The Canadian Environmental Law Association is a national NGO and an Ontario legal aid clinic. We were formed in 1970, and we assist members of the public to participate in environmental decision-making, and we also advocate for better laws to protect environmental harm. I have filed a written brief with the clerk of the committee, which I'm sure you'll receive in due course. And I do want to say as a preliminary comment that CELA is a strong supporter of the principles of a circular economy, including principles of safe material reuse, reduction in energy utilization, and reduction in discarding materials. However, there are issues I'm sure you'll investigate in this committee that I won't be delving into today. We'll probably file a second brief from CELA on issues dealing with, for example, the potential for toxic chemicals in plastics making their way into reused products. But for today, I want to say that those principles do not apply to used nuclear fuel waste. Nuclear fuel waste is high-level waste under Canada's Nuclear Fuel Safety Act. It is the waste that results after uranium fuel has been used. Natural uranium fuel has been used in the CANDU reactors in Canada. It is extremely hazardous after it's been used in the reactor, and it must be kept separated then from people and the environment for hundreds of thousands of years, according to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. There have, however, been some recent proposals and even funding toward research in Canada with the idea of, quote, reprocessing, quote, this waste, which means extracting the plutonium from the used fuel waste so that the plutonium can itself be used as a nuclear power fuel. However, plutonium can be used both as nuclear power fuel, but also in atomic weapons. And so extracting plutonium from the used nuclear waste contradicts Canada's decades-long practice of not allowing reprocessing of nuclear fuel in Canada. The reason is that it raises concerns about diversion of that separated plutonium towards atomic weapons use, something that is made vastly easier, if you can say that, for bad actors to do once the plutonium has already been separated from the very hazardous used nuclear fuel waste. And that risk exists regardless of the original intent behind the reprocessing exercise, regardless of how pure or not the extracted plutonium is. And those statements are according to, among others, the U.S. National Academies of Science and the U.S. Department of Energy. And in addition, the reprocessing itself results in other nuclear waste that is even harder to deal with than the current nuclear fuel waste that Canada is already contending with. There's more hazard. There are additional types of radioactive materials that result. Much of it is in liquid form, and there are no current prospects for the long-term disposal of that reprocessing waste. There are additionally examples elsewhere in the world where reprocessing facilities have resulted in extensive environmental contamination. The industry advocating the idea of reprocessing nuclear fuel waste has been trying to utilize ideas like waste reduction and recycling to support these proposals. But these completely miss the mark in terms of the nuclear weapons proliferation risks that are raised. Globally recognized non-proliferation experts, such as scientists at Princeton University, have been warning Canada explicitly about the dangers of allowing nuclear fuel reprocessing in Canada. So my organization, CELA, and other civil society colleagues across Canada have been calling on Canada to explicitly ban nuclear fuel reprocessing in Canada as a result of these risks. We recommend to this committee that it make that recommendation as part of its study on a circular economy. Those are my remarks to start. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
We'll now turn to the Recycling Council of Alberta. Madame Sedel, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. Happy to be here today, and I'm with the Recycling Council of Alberta. We are a grassroots charitable organization. We've been operating in Alberta since the 1987, but we work a lot with our colleagues across Canada as well. And even though we are the Recycling Council of Alberta, our mission now is actually to promote, facilitate, and advocate for circular economy, not just recycling. And we've had to make that change, as many organizations have, because we are faced now with the reality that recycling, we will never recycle our way out of this issue that we have today. So we are recognizing that there is a new paradigm that we're all working within. It's a new paradigm for both the environment, but also the economy, and it is called circular economy. And it can make a huge difference in terms of how we can achieve some of the things we want to achieve. Circular economy really is about redefining a lot of things that we've taken for granted. And if you look at the circular economy principles, essentially the first step that we so often miss is that we need to redesign systems. We need to design out waste. We need to design out pollution so that we don't have that to deal with right from the start. And systems need to be designed right from the beginning to accomplish that. Then for the materials that we do use within our economy, we need to make sure that they operate at the highest order for as long as possible so that we, again, through design, have those materials to be within the economy for a longer period of time. And then within all of this, because circular economy is a much more holistic notion really than recycling, is that all of this system within circular economy really is about trying to regenerate natural systems rather than break them down. So the ultimate imperative is a healthier environment, and that's certainly one of the things that circular economy tries to achieve. And there's some really interesting business models that circular economy embraces, and they are things that you've definitely heard about, like product life extension. Product as a service, that is really taking the economy by storm. And also sharing platforms, things like tool libraries, so that we don't all have to have one of everything, but instead we can embrace materials and products as a society and share them with each other. This not only has environmental benefits, but it also has social benefits as well. We actually, as a Recycling Council, launched a program across Canada called Circular Cities and Regions Initiative. And we actually looked at how circular economy can actually be developed at the municipal level. And we did that because so many things actually happen at the municipal level. It's a very robust part of our economy. And municipalities have a lot of ability to do a lot of things, create a lot of new policies, and really change the climate. So we have had some real success across the country with bringing some of these communities together. We've actually had communities everywhere from a few hundred right up to 500,000 that have worked within this initiative. And they are from all the provinces and at least one territory and both languages. So this is something that we're very proud of and that we want to continue. Also wanted to mention that within circular economy, speaking of policy, one of the key policies that's really important is extended producer responsibility. And this is a policy that is being adopted by virtually every province across the country and now the territories as well. And essentially, extended producer responsibility puts the responsibility back on the producer of the product and the material. And that is a very strong benefit because they are the ones that are most able to actually bring that material back into the system through a circular economy. So we really embrace EPR across all the provinces and all materials. But the one thing I will say about EPR is to this point, we have applied EPR only to residential materials when it comes to packaging, and we need to broaden that again to make it more holistic. We need to embrace all sectors, including the commercial sector. So that's just kind of a summary of our beliefs around circular economy. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Merci beaucoup. Je passerai maintenant.
Thank you. I'll give the floor to Tech Resources now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the opportunity to be here in person today. My name's Amber Johnston-Billings. I'm a Vice President at Tech Resources covering the communities area and the government and regulatory affairs area. So Tech is a proudly Canadian company. We employ 8,000 people directly in Canada and another 65,000 people indirectly across this nation. We have 4 head offices, one based in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and a satellite office in Santiago in Chile. And last year we contributed $11 billion to Canada's GDP. But today, for the purposes of the committee, we intend to focus on the Trail Smelting and Refining Complex in southern BC. And joining me is Thompson Hickey, who's the General Manager for that smelting complex. So I'll pass to him now just to describe the metals recycling program at Trail.
Thank you, Amber, and good afternoon. Trail Operations has been in business for over 125 years and has evolved to become one of the world's largest metallurgical complex and refineries. We directly employ 1,500 people and contribute approximately $1 billion to the local GDP. We produce 15 metals products, specialty metals, and chemicals, which includes 7 of Canada's 31 critical minerals. We are excited to say we recently released a report outlining the extremely low carbon footprint of our special high-grade refined zinc. The low carbon nature of Trail zinc is attributable to our use of clean and renewable power from the local Waneta hydroelectric dam and the primary sourcing of concentrate from our Red Dog mine in Alaska. In addition to our processing of mined concentrates, we are also proud of our metals recycling program that started in 1982 with lead battery recycling and has since evolved to other materials. At Trail, each year, we currently recycle about 40,000 tons of lead batteries used in cars, telecommunication, medical equipment, etc. About 5,000 tons of cathode ray tube glass from old TVs and monitors. About 500 tons of zinc alkaline batteries, those would be your Duracell Energizer consumer batteries, and about 15,000 tons of secondary materials from other industries from which we recover zinc, lead, and germanium. Over many decades, we have helped keep hundreds of thousands of tons of metals in use to support the circular economy and reduce environmental impacts. While recycling currently makes up about 5 to 10% of our total raw material supply chain, we are continually looking to develop recycling even further. Today, we are making a modest expansion in our lead battery recycling capacity, testing recovery of zinc from electric arc furnace dust, and exploring the potential to recycle lithium-ion batteries used to power electric vehicles. The Government of Canada set a mandatory target for all new light-duty vehicles to be zero emissions by 2035. This means Canada needs to build and find the raw materials for significantly more electric vehicles over the next 10 years. This also means just as many lithium-ion batteries will eventually need to be recycled. There are several differences between lead and lithium-ion batteries used in vehicles, which is particularly important when it comes to recycling. A few of these are: a lead battery is the size of a small toaster oven and can be easily removed and replaced by you and me from our vehicle. In comparison, a lithium-ion battery pack is integral to the vehicle and weighs approximately 500 kilograms. While a lead battery contains 4 to 5 elements and each battery is essentially the same regardless of manufacturer, a lithium-ion battery is made up of many components, including a wide variety of chemicals and elements that differ by manufacturer. Most lithium-ion batteries today contain lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese, all listed as Canadian critical minerals. There's a well-established circular economy around lead batteries. However, a full lithium-ion battery recycling value chain does not currently exist in Canada, nor anywhere in North America. And while a lithium battery circular economy is starting to develop in North America, there are still key questions to be answered regarding effective recycling technologies, evolving battery chemistries, ownership of the battery, as well as the regulatory framework. That being said, we see this as a major opportunity not only for Teck, but also for Canada to be first movers in this space, despite the significant capital investment required to establish a circular economy for the lithium-ion battery industry. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Amber to conclude our opening remarks.
Thanks, Thompson. So we're pleased to see that the federal government is focused on EV battery recycling, and we believe that our Trail smelter, with 120 years of innovation, is very well placed to take part both in the recycling sector and the EV battery recycling space. So thank you, and we look forward to questions.
Thank you very much to all of our witnesses for your testimonies. I'll now turn to MP Perkins to start the discussion for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for appearing. If the committee will indulge me, the first couple of questions I actually have are to our Teck witnesses. I think Ms. Johnson Billings perhaps is the person best to answer them. You guys have been in the news a little bit the last couple of weeks, interesting times with the unsolicited bid from Glencore to take over your company. I'm wondering if you could inform this committee, if Glencore is successful. First, I have a number of questions on it, but first, what would the likely impact be on jobs and the efforts you make in terms of your mining recycling system?
Thank you for the question. So yes, you would have seen in the news, obviously, we're fending off a bid that's been unanimously rejected by our board on 2 occasions from a foreign company, Glencore. I'm not sure if people are familiar with Glencore, but they don't have a great track record for a number of reasons. So they're obviously last year paid $1.75 billion worth of corruption charges, $1.1 billion of that in the US. They're well known as being corporate raiders, so they tend to come in and they buy assets, usually assets that have been pretty well run in the past and have a lot of goodwill about them. And in that process, they then tend to deplete the ore in that asset and dump the asset and move on, which leaves them with a terrible track record in terms of human rights abuses, labour strikes, and certainly environmental stewardship issues. So this is a company that we absolutely do not want to see take over one of Canada's last remaining critical minerals companies. We are Canada's largest diversified miner. We have spent decades developing assets in Canada. We have 85 Indigenous agreements. Each of those we honour. And we're worried that obviously if the Glencore takeover did happen, that we wouldn't be able to honour those commitments. On the second part of your question around the recycling piece, I think it's well known that Glencore doesn't spend a lot of money on innovation and technology. And so certainly things like pursuing something like EV battery recycling at Trail, which would require significant partnership with the federal government, significant partnership with local communities and other smaller recycling companies that are based in that tech ecosystem. the likelihood that Glencore would partner with them, put up capital to develop this, retrofit the smelter is very low, in our opinion.
Thank you. Glencore, has Glencore made any projections? In my past, in my business past, I've been involved in a lot of acquisitions, been on the acquiring end and on the other end of being working for companies that have been acquired. And generally, the acquirer's culture and approach to business takes over when you acquire a company. And you have to produce savings. Has Glencore made projections of what the savings of this acquisition might be in the lost jobs to Teck?
Yeah, so they haven't been explicit on the jobs, but they have been explicit about a headcount reduction that would accrue about $300 million of benefit to Glencore shareholders and effectively job loss in Canada. So we think that in the Glencore proposal that they put forward to shareholders, there's $4.75 billion worth of synergies that they've suggested. And if you look at the fine print in that, 5,000 of those are likely to be the loss of jobs in Canada at our two head offices in Vancouver and in Toronto. They do have a history of reducing workforce as well at site, so we don't know the proportion that would come from jobs based at our operations. But we are aware that they're very likely to take down and remove the two head offices. So there's a big job impact in Canada, which, just to link it to the critical minerals dialogue, means that you'd lose a lot of talent that needs to stay here to keep developing those critical minerals assets, doing exploration, doing things like recycling. The other big piece of that is a benefit that they've indicated they would get from paying less tax, which Glencore is facing a number of corruption charges for around the world. So that would effectively be moving their tax jurisdiction overseas. And then the assets which Teck currently owns that operate under Canadian values overseas, they would effectively be paying their revenue very likely through to those different offshore entities and then through to the Swiss headquarters in Switzerland. So effectively, Canada would be losing, we think, in the order of somewhere between 200 to 400 million of tax revenue if Glencore were to be successful in their bid. And
Glencore, I think you said $1.7 billion in corruption and bribery fines.
Yeah.
There was a recent, I think, charges and settlement, I guess it is, in the U.S. With them on their operations and around corruption and bribery. Do you know how much that was?
I think that was 1.1 billion.
Yeah. You mentioned, or your colleague mentioned, the critical minerals that you're doing, that you're mining at Trail. So obviously this would be one of our last critical mineral companies that's producing and Canadian owned that would become foreign owned. We only have one lithium producing mine right now, and it's currently owned by the Chinese government. 100% of what it does goes to China for their use in their I guess, greening or attempts to green their economy. What would it mean to lose that for our supply chain of critical minerals and our attempts to green our economy?
Yeah, so it probably means a whole range of things. But first of all, you would lose control of the Canadian-based critical minerals assets. And then you would lose control of the assets that are based overseas that currently are owned by Teck that operate with Canadian values. And they're primarily copper resources for the Teck portfolio as well as zinc resources. I think the other thing that is concerning from a critical minerals supply chain perspective is that Teck Resources has spent a long time developing very close relationships with South Korea, Japan, and engaging in a whole number of friendshoring activities, so looking to Europe as well. So that means that if Glencore were to take over, their main customers are based in China. So you would effectively see a loss of control of where the critical minerals that are produced from Canada, from Chile, from other friendly nations through to other jurisdictions. And we can't say that, obviously, but it would be unlikely that Glencore would be as well-placed and friendly to working with the Canadian government on that friendshoring initiative and the protection of critical minerals long-term.
Thank you. Yeah. Been done? Okay. I have more questions, but apparently I'm done.
Sorry.
Yeah, unfortunately, Mr. Perkins will now move to Mr. Fillmore for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for joining us today and sharing your time and experiences and wisdom with us. Ms. Seidel, I wanted to start with you. I was very interested in your discussion about extended producer responsibility, and I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that and maybe focus on where are the best practices, what other jurisdictions, other countries are doing a good job that Canada could look to, and where could Canada improve?
You know, what's interesting is we actually do have one of the best practices here, and that is British Columbia has some of the best EPR programs in the world. And they are certainly used as a model. They're being used increasingly as a model now for the US states and even federally as they're looking at implementing EPR across the United States. They are looking very closely to BC as their model. But that being said, we, as with most things related to waste, look to Europe for a lot of these things. And Europe tends to be very progressive on waste issues, and EPR is no exception. So as we are enhancing our EPR systems across the country, we are very much borrowing ideas from the EU because they tend to be just that much more progressive than us. But again, that being said, we certainly ourselves do good work on EPR, especially other than that one point that I brought up that for packaging we are focusing only on residential and we need to focus on commercial as well.
Okay, thanks for that. Now we know that the EU has does things very well collectively. For example, the single cell phone charger initiative and so forth. But your Canadian example was limited to British Columbia. Do you feel there is a missing national piece here that this work should be rolled out equally across all provinces and territories through a national effort?
Yeah, you know what? That's one of the challenges we have with EPR. Actually, we do with a lot of waste policy, is because the jurisdictionally, the provinces actually have authority over waste. So recently, I'm sure you've heard about what's happening with Environment Canada and all the new single-use plastics regulations, for example. And those actually are being done at the federal level as we haven't done much federally in terms of waste issues because of that jurisdictional challenge. But we now, Environment Canada has a whole new interest in especially plastics and zero plastics particularly. So we are starting to see this happen more. And I think this is a very good thing because we've tried to create more of a national system through CCME is the only real mechanism that we had to try to get the provinces all on board to be the same. But it has been a little bit clunky, to be honest. And I mean, provinces aren't always as good at working together as they should be. So the more that the federal government can really set the stage, I think the better, so that we can actually move forward at a national level as opposed to just waiting for the provinces to all catch up.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned that the efforts in BC regarding EPR to date are limited to household level consumer goods and not getting into corporate work. Is there a particular barrier, or is it just a matter of hasn't ramped up there yet?
Yeah, actually it's a complicated answer, but basically, and so the limit to residential materials is for packaging and printed paper. That's the blue box materials are the ones that have been limited to residential. The other materials, like for example, you look at tires, used oil, those actually cross the sectors. So that's not just residential. So it's not just residential because it can only be residential. It's because that is the way it has been done historically. But that is not good enough anymore. We need to expand that because there's way more material that comes out of the commercial sector than out of the residential sector. And I can tell you the big barrier is the waste companies because the waste companies feel that the commercial sector is their area. They control it. They have always controlled it. And if we expand EPR to include all the commercial sector, that is going to really enter their turf. And so they have been opposed to it from the beginning. So it's purely a political reason why this has not happened. Alberta just introduced EPR regulations last fall. We were really hoping that we would be the first ones to actually bring in commercial, but again, that didn't happen for a number of reasons. But it is coming. Quebec is talking about it. BC is talking about it. It's just a matter of time, but it can't happen soon enough.
Okay, thank you for that. The chair will cut me off if I've run out of time, but until I'm apprehended, maybe I'll go on with one more. In your opinion, segueing from that, what's the best way that governments can hold corporations accountable for the waste that they generate, but also to make sure that they're manufacturing products that are able to be reduced? What kind of mechanisms have you seen working there?
I actually think extended producer responsibility is probably the best mechanism we've seen so far. It has to be married with other things as well, like other supporting regulations. But in terms of an overarching policy, what EPR does is it puts the responsibility fully back on the producer, who then can't ignore it anymore because they're the ones that are not only responsible for paying for it, they're also both responsible for meeting targets. So it makes them pay a whole new level of attention that they haven't had to pay before. And it is already making a big difference in other jurisdictions like Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that my time is probably up at this point.
Salut, Monsieur Fillmore. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. That's the fact, Mr. Fillmore. Monsieur Lemire, thank you. My question is for Ms. McClenaghan. We have learned during the course of this study by the committee that our government was carrying out studies with the transportation of hazardous goods. You have drawn our attention to plutonium. We had been looking at plastic. When exposed nuclear material is exposed, do you think that Canada should be more transparent with respect to what is being done with other nations? What international conventions should we study to shed some light on the questions that face us?
Merci.
3 years in. Canada is a party to the International Atomic Energy Agency's Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. That's a 1968 treaty that was in force in 1970. Now there is work happening worldwide to include a convention or treaty that would ban reprocessing nuclear waste. Canada has not been supportive of that approach to date, at least not explicitly. Canada had a de facto ban, or at least an operational practice, not to support utilizing reprocessing of nuclear waste, specifically because of the weapons risks, along with highly enriched uranium, which we don't do here either. And unfortunately, there was a real opportunity for Canada to include a ban in its just released updated nuclear waste policy, which the Atomic Energy Agency had asked it to do. But instead, Canada said in that policy released a couple of weeks ago that because there was no current reprocessing of nuclear waste, it was outside of the scope of the nuclear waste policy. So that was, I think, a real missed opportunity. But because the advocates, as I mentioned, are arguing for use of nuclear power as part of the answer to climate change, and that's a different day to have a different discussion about that. The types of nuclear technology are being examined, and some of them are proposing to use as fuel reprocessed nuclear fuel, i.e. plutonium, extracted from reactors from the used fuel. So yes, Canada does need to work with its partners, but Canada needs to also pick up its own socks. It has been providing research money to some of the industry companies who want to explore this type of technology. And furthermore, in the recent budget, Canada, without discrimination, added nuclear to a range of tax credits and clean technology credits and benefits without excluding reprocessing nuclear fuel from that list.
Despite the signing of the Basel Convention, Canada has continued to export electronic waste, to developing countries. The BAN has indicated that it was inquiring about the exports of Canada of this type of electronic waste as of 2002. But it leaves Vancouver and it goes to other ports. For more than 10 years now, BAN has said that recycling electronic waste is something common, that Canada sends it from Canada to developing countries. Over the course of all these years, we have signed agreements on exporting, but it has been indicated to us that there were challenges with respect to the exporting of electronic materials abroad. What is your opinion of the situation?
Is that question for me?
Oui, certainement.
Yes, it is for you.
Yes. So we have at CELA weighed in from time to time on Canada's participation in the Basel Convention, which deals more broadly with hazardous waste and requires, as you say, consent of the importing country and accedance to a list of products and technologies and substances that would not be exported. We have had concerns that, particularly in respect of some of those exports, Canada hasn't. There were some shipments, for example, that sat in ports in Thailand, I believe it was, that had originated from Canadian ports. And it took a lot of campaigning by many civil society organizations, both here and there, for Canada to finally repatriate that waste. So we'd like to encourage Canada to be, a leader in terms of how we're handling waste, and not to allow for that type of unfortunate action, which is, harmful to the receiving countries and embarrassing for Canada.
Where can you draw the line in terms of electronic e-waste and recycling and its impact on the environment? We know that plastics and certain types of electronics have a real impact on the environment. Where can we draw the line on this?
Again, for me. Yes, one of the things CELA works on is toxic chemicals regulation, and in particular with respect to recycling products, we're quite concerned that we need to have much better disclosure and labeling about the toxic chemicals that might be found in plastics, for example, and traceability, so that we can make sure that those plastics that were produced with toxic chemicals don't end up, for example, in children's toys. In terms of electronics recycling, one of the concerns we have, well, not just electronics, but various types of plastics, can end up with very, very long-lived contaminants. And, there are campaigns going on in Europe, Canada, and the US around PFAS chemicals, for example, which are used not only for firefighting foam, but also in some plastics. And these are finding their way into people's bodies in Canada. So making sure that we think about what we're recycling and what's in the materials that we're recycling is critical. And as I mentioned at the outset, we will likely file an additional brief from CELA on that topic, because the brief I filed so far was just on the topic of nuclear waste reprocessing.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Massey.
And before I get to my question, start with Ms. Johnston-Billings. I want to preface with a case in Windsor right now that's taking place. It's not electronic metals and plastics at the time, but it's Windsor Salt, which is now owned by Stone Canyon Industries, a holding company from the United States. They bought as well a facility in Alberta and closed it down in Lindenberg that had been there since 1948. They also bought K&S in the United States, salt. And now there's a strike because they're known for union busting. That's really what they're doing. And there's only been, this is a second strike in over 100 years. I think it's been 30-something years before that. It's their own natural resources. And I'm looking at the situation that you're going through right now with Tech Resources Limited. And this committee is going to be looking at C-34, which is important. Unfortunately, previous governments have raised the threshold for review, including on our natural resources, to actually stop many of the reviews that could have taken place, should have taken place on many industries. And I'll be moving an amendment to the Act that would include any natural resource, especially when you look at some of the critical minerals that we have coming through for the electrification of vehicles and so forth, to actually get an automatic review despite its size. And the reason I'm raising all of this is what has been used in this parliamentary system for the 2 decades I've been here is that don't worry about it, we can do undertakings. And we've seen, undertakings being whether they actually supposedly create a head office in Canada, they have job guarantees for a short period of time, or they have production. And we've seen that to be a lie as well, too, when you just look at U.S. Steel and Hamilton. So I guess my question to you is with regards to your situation is have you guys looked at, undertakings? I don't have any confidence in them. And just wondering whether the thoughts of the board or any of your analysis as to how serious you think they might be, especially given the reputation that's been well earned by Glencore versus others. I think we're pretty well just giving away an accountability. So perhaps you can highlight on that, because that's our laws. We can create undertakings, but enforcing them is another story.
Thank you. So obviously Glencore does have a very poor track record when it comes to labour rights. Just to your first point, they had 65 strikes since 2013. A number of those lasted 200 days plus, and in some cases they just shut down the asset instead of engaging with workers. So very problematic. On the question of undertakings, I'm not in a position to be able to direct the federal government to look at this, except to continue providing the information that I've provided today. Certainly a net benefit review at a later point, we're aware, is absolutely part of the regulatory process. I think you can see in Glencore's filings that they expect the regulatory process in Canada, I think it was referred to as, almost a walk in the park, and it will take 12 months or so. And we would like to highlight that we think that's very unlikely given their practices, particularly around their corruption charges. And so certainly we have asked the federal government to take a close look at this, but certainly we're not in a position to ask for anything beyond that. And in terms of the decision that they would make at a later date, certainly that's in their court. But we welcome C-34 and some of the amendments that might be made in there. Yeah,
so we'll look forward for potentially some of your testimony for that, and to include, I know that it would be interesting to have some of that. The good news is that Peggy Nash, when she was here, the NDP critic for industry, she fought like heck to stop McDonnell Detweiler from being sold off, and so we stopped that. And I worked on the potash when this country tried to decimate our potash. Imagine we did that with Ukraine right now. We almost gave that away with regards to farming and agriculture, because that was on the table. So we'll make sure that you get, I'd like to include you at the witness list for that. If I could quickly move to Mrs. McClanahan, with regards to transportation of hazardous goods and materials, do you know how robust of information is out there? I've been working on the situation with the DGR. This is a nuclear waste facility that's planned off of Lake Huron, about 1.5 kilometers its reach. It's about the length of the CN Tower. It was first turned down by Saugeen Nations, and then they moved another kilometer away from there to try another go at the attempt. And this is about the storage of nuclear waste for over 100 million years. The previous ones that have been built of this, one in New Mexico, caught on fire. And then also, too, is that we would then have to have radioactive material transported through Ontario in different parts from Darlington and other places if it was to become the storage facility, and even potentially from the United States. Can you kind of maybe give us a little bit of analysis of how safe and those issues are? I mean, I was part of a campaign as well to stop nuclear waste going through the Great Lakes to be recycled in Scotland, of all places, and then returned to Canada. Putting it on the water obviously isn't the greatest thing, but at any rate, right. Can you highlight that, please?
that proposal, the last one you spoke about, was the proposal to ship steam generators that had been in use at Bruce Power. And they withdrew that application because of public concern and First Nations concern and parliamentarians' concern, Great Lakes concern. In terms of the DGRs, there have been two proposals. The first one that you talked about was going to be for low and intermediate level waste, quite close to the lake. And you're right that it got the EA approvals, but there had been a commitment by Ontario Power Generation not to proceed unless Saugeen Ojibwe Nation gave their consent, which they did not. This one that's now proposed by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is for high-level nuclear fuel waste, and they're down to 2 communities after looking at 22 and doing studies on those, one in Northwest Ontario and one in South Bruce. In terms of transportation, there only recently is starting to be a little bit of information from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization on transportation, but there are no containers yet that are approved for transporting that kind of quantity of nuclear fuel waste to the facility. Certainly some transportation does occur, as for example, the removal of some of the fuel from White Shell has gone already to the Chalk River Laboratory in the Ottawa Valley. There is extensive nuclear fuel waste transportation already going on in Canada, particularly in Ontario. And that does include transport on the Great Lakes, as a matter of fact. And the commissioners of the Nuclear Safety Commission have said there's extensive transportation.
Quick, because I know the chair is giving me a little bit extra time just for a second here. Well, we've put up with your notice of motion last thing, and that took a long time. So you can give me this one last moment, just real quickly.
Your questions weren't good.
Yeah. So, is it possible that we could be an importer of nuclear waste with our current trade agreements? Is that a possibility if we actually do get the facility built?
Not only that, but we already are. And the nuclear waste policy that was just released by Canada a couple of weeks ago reconfirms that. And it's actually quite concerning, particularly cobalt-60, which is in itself quite dangerous types of nuclear waste.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll now turn to Mr. Viss and Mr. Généreux for 5 minutes.
Can you just give me a mark at 2.5?
2.5, yes.
Thank you. Ms. McClellan, are you aware that Volkswagen was charged with 60 counts of breaching the the Canadian Environmental Protection Act?
I have vague awareness of that just from the media. I was not involved in that case.
Okay. Well, under those charges, Volkswagen essentially lied to the government of Canada about the emissions that their cars were producing. They installed what are called defeat devices in approximately 130,000 diesel vehicles imported into Canada. The government of Canada has now embarked on a new agreement with Volkswagen. Despite an order from this committee in the Parliament of Canada, the Department of Industry is in breach of that parliamentary order to provide us with a copy of that contract. Essentially, they lied to this committee that they would do so. And we are now without information about how much money the government of Canada has given Volkswagen. That said, are you aware of any other car company that has breached the Environmental Protection Act in Canada?
No, I'm not in a position to comment on that for this committee. It's not something I looked into to prepare for tonight.
Do you think it's ironic that one of the only, if the only company in the history of Canada to lie to Canadians about emission standards within the last 7 years is going to receive billions of dollars from Canadian taxpayers to protect the environment after they were fined $190 million for breaching Canadian laws in an unprecedented fashion?
Yes, Mr. Gahir.
So just two points, I guess. One is that we passed the motion on Monday, and we said we sort of agreed on a week. week's timeline? Secondly, I want to ask Mr. Viss about the relevance of this line of questioning, because the study is obviously on electronics, metals, and plastics recycling, and I do think his line of questioning is off topic.
I'll let Mr. Viss pursue with his line of questioning. However, I will note that Mr. Viss, to pretend that the government has lied when all parties agreed 2 days ago to ask for these documents, I think it's a little rich.
No,
but I'll let you pursue.
I wasn't referring to that motion. I was referring to the order put forward by the committee, Mr. Chair. The first time. That order still stands. We didn't negate that order.
I'm confident that in due time the documents will be produced as the committee has requested no later than 2 days ago. But I take your point of order, Mr. Gahir. Mr. Viss, I'll let you pursue because I think we're fairly liberal in how we interpret the text of this motion. So you can pursue your line of questioning.
The point is, Mr. Chair, and I'll just respond to the point of order before I go back onto my questions, is that it is rich that the government of Canada charged Volkswagen with 60 breaches of breaking the law, charged them $190 million. Now they're giving them billions and billions of dollars to fight climate change when they were criminally prosecuted under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So as it relates to this study, to Mr. Gahir's point of order, what is important, Mr. Chair, to note is that if we are going to operate in a circular economy, if we are going to develop critical minerals, and if we are going to put the trust of Canadian taxpayer dollars into a company with a horrible environmental record, we have to be asking the tough questions. I've owned a Volkswagen car. I love driving them. It's a great product. But they broke the law in a very serious way. The Americans charged them billions of dollars, Mr. Chair. So let me go back to my questioning, and I thank you for your judicious interpretation of the standing orders. But I know I'm in line with them as well in my line of questioning. And Mr. Gahir, I know you got a job to do, but I got a job to do too, and that's to stand up for Canadians and to stand up to make sure that taxpayer dollars are used effectively.
And
Thank you,
Mr. Viss, you've asked me to tell you at the 2 minutes 30 mark, and you've reached it. So
thank you very much.
That is my job here. And Mr. Généreux, I'll recognize you for the rest of the time.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame.
Thank you. Ms. Seidel, you spoke, you said earlier that in Alberta, and earlier in my life I was a mayor, we called this in Quebec back burners that were installed. But I heard you say that the municipalities should be able to do much more than they do at present. So what type of action would you foresee they're doing? What should the government of Alberta put forward with the help of the municipalities?
I did.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, very fair question. Why municipalities and why they can play such a key role in circular economy. And a lot of it is circular economy landscape is changing very quickly. And one thing about municipalities is not only do a lot of things happen at that level related to policy, related to even economic development, is a lot happens at the municipality. But they as a government are quite nimble, especially compared to, not that higher levels of government are less nimble, but they really are. So if you want things to happen quickly and you want things to move forward, municipalities are a good way to drive policy. And when you look at what we did in our program was we brought together a lot of different departments, because one thing that circular economy does is it embraces a lot more than just the environment department. It embraces other departments as well. Things like procurement, things like energy, all come together under a circular economy framework. And municipalities are one of the levels that can bring those departments together to look at ways to build circularity within that community.
My next question is this then. There are communities in northern Quebec near Saint Jérôme that decided to put a tax on certain types of plastics, utensils that could be, that are disposable, and they were able to raise some $15,000 that they put back into their local community activities. Do you think then that the carbon tax that the federal government has, and which is in part given back to citizens, should give an opportunity to local municipalities to take more action, more legitimate action, more than they have done in the past? Do you think that this would not be something of great interest?
That's a great comment. I think that would be a very positive use of carbon funds for sure, is to put them back into communities to actually make a difference at the local level. I would certainly say that would be probably not only positive, but could be one of the most effective ways of actually making change. And I will comment on the plastics too, that's a good example of how municipalities, and this is happening across the country now, because Environment Canada under CEPA has made these plastic single-use regulations. Now what's happening is municipalities are starting to build on that and create their own local bylaws that actually, that probably wouldn't have happened if it had not been for the federal government actually leading the charge on zero plastics. So I think it's a good example of how different levels of government can work together to make a difference.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Gaillard.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for their testimony so far for the committee. My first question is for Ms. Johnston-Billings. So Bill C-34 has been referred to this committee in terms of how it'll strengthen the ICA. Could you potentially elaborate on how Bill C-34 and the ICA will support you in this to prevent the the hostile takeover from Glencore?
Thank you for the question. So at this point, our shareholder vote is on April 26, which is next Wednesday. And that is a proposal for us to separate into two world-class companies that would both be headquartered in Canada. At the moment, that's in shareholders' hands as to whether we're able to go through that vote. Obviously, we have the protection of our A-class shareholders, but we'll see how that vote goes next Wednesday. To your question on Bill C-34, it's unlikely that we would see that obviously updated in time to play a role in this particular situation. But at the same time, that's not what we're directly asking for, as I mentioned previously. We are in a position where we're highlighting to the government the issues in this potentially foreign takeover by a company that has a terrible track record in human rights, labour abuse and corruption. And we would expect that the Government of Canada would look very closely at approving that transaction if it was to go ahead, which we at the moment believe it will not, and has been unanimously voted down by our board on 2 occasions. So at the moment, all of our defences are up in terms of this not happening. But if it was successful and went through to a regulatory review and there were changes, that review could happen earlier. If that review does not allow those powers to change, then obviously it would still need to go through a fairly extensive review in Canada under the ICA. Thanks.
So in a hypothetical world, if Bill C-34 were imagine it's active currently, would you like to comment on how it could potentially help in this current situation with Glencore?
I don't think that I can comment on that, but thank you for the question.
No, definitely. I also wanted to ask about your critical mineral strategy. So critical minerals are obviously important in electrical vehicle batteries, clean energy, information and technology, and defense applications. Do you have any comments on the initiatives that Canada has put in place specifically to reuse critical minerals and e-waste?
I might pass that question to Thompson Hickey, who obviously leads the Trail Smelter. Certainly I'll just comment in terms of the first part of the question around the Government of Canada. I would just like to say that the budget was fantastic in terms of providing a whole number of different areas that will help us develop critical minerals, including the recycling piece, but also the extraction, processing. There's a number of tax incentives in there that are very helpful for us to develop, process, and explore for more critical minerals. So Thompson, I'll pass to you for the second part of the question, which is how we can develop recycling facilities and use federal government support to recycle more EVs.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I would echo Amber's comments there on the framework that Canada is proposing around critical minerals. Really gives impetus to companies like ours to push forward. As I mentioned in tech already, we produce about 7 of the 31 critical minerals. In terms of investing further to broaden that suite of critical minerals is doable from a technical perspective. There are sometimes some challenges from an economic perspective around circular economy, but yeah, any support that the federal government through the various ministries could offer to move this forward, certainly on some nascent businesses that are developing, as I mentioned, around the recycling of EV batteries. This is a very new and developing industry, and it's not really clear on where things are tracking. So anything around frameworks would help around the critical minerals. But we do appreciate the support that the government has tabled so far.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your support for the budget as well. Are there further steps that we can take to increase the recovery of critical minerals from e-waste, especially in high-value minerals like iron, copper, gold?
I can try that as well. So currently in Canada, actually, there is recycling of e-waste. At Tech Metals, we looked into that to develop processing around it. We found it not to be workable. It's really fundamentally around the technology that you can employ. Actually, the subject of Glencore came up earlier, and actually they do have facilities in Canada that do recycle at the moment. But in terms of any support, in terms of further recycling e-waste, certainly the regulatory framework that was talked about before in terms of exporting e-waste is obviously not helpful for Canada. And if those factors can be strengthened, that's great for Canada. But overall in Canada, we have the technical capability to further that industry. It does typically take investment, but these are not technical challenges that cannot be overcome.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, MP Gahir. Before we continue with questions, I'd like to welcome Madame Dawn Marabi-Leach, who's the chairperson of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board. Welcome to this committee, and thanks for joining us. And so before we resume questioning, I'd like to, for us to have the opportunity to hear your opening remarks before we move along. So the floor is yours, and welcome again.
Miigwech. Bidab Indigenous cause, Jijak Dodam, Wigwas Kiniga Mina, Andekam Nakaning, Donjaba. So I just stated my name in my language, my spirit name, which is Bidabin Dawn, and that I'm from beautiful Manitoulin Island and the Andekam Nakaning First Nation. And so I just want to say, Miigwech, for inviting me to speak with you today about the Indigenous people's participation and involvement in the development and support of electronics, metals, and plastics recycling industry. As mentioned, I'm chair of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, and I work alongside First Nation, Métis, and Inuit economic and community business leaders from across Canada. So our board is put in place to advise the whole of the federal government on Indigenous economic development. One of the things that we have been working on is a national Indigenous economic strategy for Canada that's actually was released back in June 2022. In that strategy, it talks about how to engage Indigenous people and in Canada's economy. And it's a really great blueprint for the government, for corporate Canada, for institutions, for our people, and for all Canadians to use as a guide towards economic reconciliation. So when we look at this type of work, we feel that the engagement of our communities and our businesses in this industry would be something that we would welcome. When it comes to, it relates to our responsibility as stewards of the land, and so recycling, reusing, and and also the cleanup of waste is really important to us. But there's a need to produce some better data and an understanding of Indigenous specific engagement in recycling and environmental cleanup. We must also use baseline studies, including traditional knowledge studies, to better understand the components of the environment that are valuable to Indigenous communities. Renewing, recycling, and reusing has cultural significance for many Indigenous communities. Often embedded within traditional knowledge is the concept of a collective responsibility to respect and maintain the earth and use only that which is needed for sustenance. Environmental sustainability and ecological integrity must be included in all aspects of electronics, metals, and plastics recycling. And this cannot be done without the input or involvement of Indigenous communities. We must recognize the important role of the environment in the economic, social, and cultural well-being of Indigenous peoples, and the importance of respecting, preserving, and maintaining the knowledge and practices of Indigenous peoples that contributes to the conservation of the environment. There's also an opportunity for increasing Indigenous procurement opportunities within this industry. As we know, Canada has established a 5% set-aside for Indigenous businesses of all government contracts. And although despite this commitment to increase access to federal procurement opportunities for Indigenous businesses, year over year, Indigenous businesses have received less than 1% of the value of contracts for tendering goods and services to the Government of Canada. So the National Indigenous Economic Strategy that I referred to has a call to economic prosperity number 54, which speaks to this responsibility of procuring Indigenous businesses and the services of Indigenous companies for the cleanup of contaminated sites. As we know, Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by pollution and contamination caused by activities that have environmentally hazardous outcomes based on their location. For example, Member 2, a Mi'kmaq community located in Unama'ki, Cape Breton Island, had experienced runoff of toxic chemicals from the Sydney Tar Ponds hazardous waste facility. They discovered polycyclic aromatic chardrohybins in the lobster, and extensive consultations and research resulted in the decision to begin cleanup operations in 2009. A contract to operate and maintain a material processing facility during the Sydney Tar Ponds and coke ovens cleanup was awarded to a local Indigenous company. I'd like to just share a couple more recommendations. In areas of the country where the Indigenous population is more than 5%, the target for the total value of federal contracts awarded to Indigenous businesses should also be proportionally higher. And training Indigenous cultural awareness for procurement officers should be mandatory, especially in this industry. And finally, we recommend that the electronics, metal, and recycling industry also institute Indigenous procurement targets and annually report on whether those targets are being met. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was also clear that establishing constructive, mutually beneficial relationships and partnerships with Indigenous communities will contribute to community economic growth, improve community health and well-being, and ensure environmental sustainability, all of which will ultimately benefit Indigenous peoples and all Canadians. I just want to say I heard the discussion on the critical minerals, and I think that there's some good potential on some of the recycling. I know that hearing that the technology might not be up to par yet on doing that critical minerals recycling, but we'd really like to see if there are opportunities, business opportunities to become involved, because we want to be, as stewards of the land, we want to have a larger role in making sure that we do proper recycling and reusing of waste. We think that this is important, rather than having it just stored in our traditional territories. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today.
Very much, Madame Leach, and you arrived just in time, colleagues. As was expected, the bells are ringing, which means a vote has been called in the House, and I require unanimous consent to pursue a little further our meeting. I would suggest that at 5:55 we adjourn for members to reach the House so that we can vote. Do I have unanimous consent to continue until 5:55? Great. Thank you very much. Donc, on peut reprendre.
We can begin now, then, with Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Chair. Kwe Miigwech, for your testimony, Ms. Leach. The mining industry and Indigenous communities have worked together in Quebec, in the northern part of Quebec. Do you need translation? Kwe and Miigwech, the mining industry and Indigenous communities have worked together in northern Quebec and northern Canada on certain projects. Can you speak to the spirit of collaboration in terms of environmental and economic development amongst First Nations? Do you think that there should be the storage of these minerals near where they are extracted from the land? What is your view?
Well, I think that each case would have to be assessed individually on what can be stored, but I think the recycling of minerals, the world doesn't have an unlimited source of copper, lithium. We only have a limited, and we know that limited availability of critical minerals. Canada has a lot, but you just can't take them out. We have to start looking at the possibilities of the recycling, even if it's minor amounts that we have to recycle for now. We need to look at the best ways to do that. I know that just taking from the land the important critical minerals that the world needs today is part of the solution to meeting the needs of people globally. But the other side of things is how can we do this sustainably? How can we better recycle what we do take out of the earth? I think that we see lots of landfill sites. We see in-ground storage of waste where there's still mineral components still in that storage. We need to look at this, even if it's, I think that there's business opportunities here to do that. And but I think industry has a responsibility to help with that, too. There needs to be a plan beyond the extraction of the resources. The plan needs to include how do you reuse and recycle all of the minerals out of the waste that does exist. And there's really good examples around the world already where waste is being recycled and where they are looking at piles of waste. Now, I can't recall all the names, but I've heard of a couple of examples, and I believe there's examples in Alaska where they're doing this already. And but there's other parts of the world that are looking at this, and a lot of the multinational resource development companies are taking this very seriously and looking at ways that they can start to become involved in the solution of recycling.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you. Mr. Massé?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Miigwech, Ms. Leach, with regards to the 5% for procurement that you mentioned, and you said you're only kind of reaching the 1% threshold, can you tell us, is there any expectations, or is there a plan in place to raise that to the next year, or is it just kind of, oh, we missed it again this year, and oh, well, hopefully we'll make it next year, and or can you bank that set aside for a following year? That would be another logical, like a plan for like over 5 to 10 years to raise it to that threshold. It just seems to me it's like a hollow promise if it's 5% and then we don't do much to make it to 5% and we kind of hang around lurking about the 1 to 4%. And where I'm from, I'm very familiar there. I'm from Windsor, Ontario. Is in the United States, they actually have hard set aside numbers for large infrastructure projects. We finally got some money for my riding with the Gordie Howe Bridge as a community investment fund, very modest amount. But anyway, it's the first time it was done. Tell us, and this will be my last thing because it'll be out of time, but tell us what happens when you miss the thresholds and what's the next step in there?
Well, this time around when the target was set, there's been a lot of work in co-developing how we're going to Indigenous organizations got together to help the government to meet these targets. So some of the things that we're working on right now are things like an Indigenous-led procurement institute that will host a certified Indigenous business directory, and that business directory will be based on a definition of Indigenous businesses that we've developed as Indigenous people. We feel that we want to make sure that Indigenous businesses are truly benefiting from the procurement targets and the set-asides, because there is an issue right now. Sometimes if there's $10 million contract and a partnership with an Indigenous company, but that company's only making $1 million, they check the whole $10 million contract as being part of the set-aside. So we're working with Procurement Canada, Treasury Board, and Indigenous Services Canada to develop what the criteria is going to be and how that's going to be used. And this this new Indigenous-led Procurement Institute will be involved in measuring the progress. But there is a report coming out later this year on how the government has done in meeting those targets. So we're looking forward to that report. I believe it's due in the fall to see. But right now that report won't be using the definition that we have of Indigenous people. It probably will still be measuring the $10 million contract as opposed to the million that might be going to Indigenous business. But as we go further, there is a deadline to meet this target in 2025. So there is it's really important, and I think doing this work through a code development process with Indigenous people is going to actually be a better process going forward.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. So we have 5 more minutes, colleagues. Instead of going through a formal round, I just open the floor for any questions one might have. I recognize Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Siegel, I think you're online, sorry. When we talk about the circular economy, and it seems like BC is really leading, and as well as Quebec and Canada, we talk about the producer having the responsibility to look at the recycling material, to receive the recycling material at the end of its life, and to reuse it. And so I think we've talked about something called out waste. And the example that we've had before is if you go to the grocery store, and in Ontario right now you get a paper bag, which is great, but then in it you put your bread, which is wrapped in plastic with a plastic tag. You put your jug of milk in the bag that is all plastic. You've put your sandwich, which is wrapped in plastic, into the box. So obviously we look at single-use plastics, but we've got bigger issues. Can you please tell me, of this out waste, as we're calling it, what are the substitutes? What are the substitutes going to be? What are people going to see in their grocery paper bag going forward if we do it correctly?
The important thing is that we don't necessarily look for substitutes, but we look instead for ways to reduce material. And that's the piece we always miss. We think if we can recycle something, then it's okay if we produce it. But instead, we need to look at the system. Okay, shopping bags is a perfect example. The best option for shopping bags, without question, is reusable bags. So we should all be reusing reusable bags instead of worrying about whether we can recycle the shopping bags that we're using, the single-use shopping bags. We should not have single-use items unless we absolutely have to. And we need to wean ourselves off that crazy thing that's sold on the basis of convenience that is actually just a bad idea from the start. So again, we need to start thinking from square one. How do I get the service that I want without creating waste? And there are lots of examples of how we can do that, but instead we so often just look at the easiest way instead of the best way.
So we look at
Mr. Williams. I'll have to cut you off because I see Mr. Erskine-Smith who also has a question. So Nate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and also for Ms. Seidel, you mentioned extended producer responsibility. That's a core function for the province to tackle in a primary way. When we look at the federal recycling activity and action, there is a strategy in place to reduce plastic pollution, of course. But again, much of this is interjurisdictional. You mentioned the role of municipal governments. So when we look at electronic waste, metals waste, what is the role the federal government should be playing here over and above what they're currently doing?
Yeah, and see, this is where we get into, again, the jurisdictional issue, because extended producer responsibility, which is really the answer, one of the key answers to electronic waste, is a provincial jurisdiction. So the regulations end up being provincial, but there is a move through CCME to try to make those EPR regulations more consistent across the country. And that's a good start, because if we get more economies of scale, then we are more likely to actually get the outcomes that we want. But yeah, it's again, we struggle with this in Canada because of the jurisdictional issues, but we need to, as much as possible, make that consistent across the country.
Thank you very much. So thanks to it's too short, Mr. Williams. So we'll.
You already answered my question.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. I don't know if I would wish that on you, but I want to thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to join us this afternoon. It is much appreciated. Apologies that we have to end this meeting earlier. And on that note, meeting adjourned.
Merci aux traducteurs.